Nagarjuna had once said, since all is empty, all is possible. In your first year of undergrad, you found your self-professed first love, which was classical Indian and Buddhist philosophy. So let's rewind the clock. Let's go back in time. Take me back to your freshman year at the New College of Florida. What was it about Nagarjuna, the Madhyamaka tradition, Shunyata, and classical Indian and Buddhist philosophy in general that made you fall head over heels?
You got to first keep in mind that college for me was sort of a mind-blowing experience. I was not on an academic track, you might say, before college. And so I got there really just eyes wide open, didn't know what I was going to do, but had acquired a little bit of interest in Indian philosophy as a result of one chance event, which was that my grandfather, he was a Unitarian minister. And so it was sort of the closest thing to an intellectual I knew. And he, I guess, he had enough with he wasn't going to read them again. He had a collection of books on Indian philosophy, or not Indian philosophy, on Indian really religious thought primarily, and as well as just books on Buddhism more generally. And I read, it's probably the only book I think I read cover to cover before college. And it was The Three Pillars of Zen, which of course is not Indian philosophy, it's Japanese philosophy, comes from China, but originally the idea comes from India. And that stuck with me somehow. So when I got to college, I was like, if there's anything at all related to that, I'd like to take it. And I went to a really small college with no grades and no requirements and stuff like that. And so it's the kind of place where there's a lot of self-study, and you often take courses with on idiosyncratic topics, because there's just a relatively small collection of people. So there was one guy who happened to be a Buddhologist, and that sort of was the guy who represented all of Asian everything.
Yeah.
So I just took everything with him because I was really fascinated. And why, to the question of why I was fascinated. So I think this is before I knew anything about Western philosophy or philosophy under that heading. And what I liked about the stuff I was reading, especially in the Indian tradition, and not just, by the way, the Madhyamaka tradition, I was interested in what, is, there's two schools of Buddhist philosophy, actually three schools, but the main schools being Theravada and Madhyamaka, Mahayana, and I was also interested in the schools of Theravada tradition, the Theravada tradition. But what struck me about them was there was a rigor to the thinking, but at the same time, they were talking about stuff that seemed to matter to me. And I had no exposure, as I said, to things like Aristotle or Plato or anything, but my vague, I think, sense in the back of my head was that stuff was kind of word games about stuff that I don't care very much about. And of course that's, it's like a high school student reaction to something, but I must say that to this day, I mean, I don't read Sanskrit and I don't read Pali, but long term, I do hope to learn these languages as a sort of a hobby. But to this day, I maintain a lay interest in that stuff, and I continue to love how they always seem to keep their finger on the sort of the relevant questions. And
what are the relevant questions?
Well, they're questions like, what's the source of suffering? What is the nature of the mind and the self? What's the nature of external reality?
Easy questions.
Right. Easy questions. Exactly. Right. So you might absolutely think that their answers are systematically wrong, but you got to give them credit for staying focused on those kinds of questions, where there's a temptation, I think, always in philosophy. This is something Thomas Nagel says, to make it easier than it is. And I think what he means by that is, sort of change the subject to something that you can resolve. So, and by resolve, I mean kind of as a matter of poll numbers, get everybody to agree that this is the answer to the problem. So, you analyze a word like, what does the word knowledge mean in English? Mm-hmm. And I don't want to at all disparage that project because it has import and it is maybe solvable, but you might think that that's somehow a distillation or a sort of superficial ripoff of what we were originally trying to do in, the dialogues. So anyway, the answer to your question is people like Nagarjuna impressed me for the combination of their rigor, but also their focus. They spoke to things that I cared about just as a human being. And I think everyone does if they actually spend the time to expose themselves to that stuff. They might decide, oh, well, that's too hard, I'm going to do something else. But it's hard not to be shaken by the questions.